I'm excited to talk with all of you today about theater and its role, creating a forum for public witness. It's incredible to be in this space again. I love this space, but also to see Penumbra's history adorning your walls. It's a bit emotional for me because the founder, of course, is my father, Lou Bellamy, and his words from the beginning of the theater are up here on the walls, and it's been quite a journey over 37 years of continuous production, thank goodness. It was touch and go there for a minute. So today what I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about theater broadly, and then share with you 4 examples of the work that we do, which I think are pretty different, which illustrate the possibility for theater, I think, not only to help us critically reflect on our lives and our living, but also to model and shape ways of being in the world that are more just and, I would argue, more humane. So first I wanted to just begin with a question about what is theater. Theater, of course, is the act of looking at ourselves. It takes risk. It takes vulnerability. It takes faith in the process. It takes a community. And one of the most beautiful moments, I think, inside of a theater space is that moment when everyone joins in a shared experience and we go on a journey together. We all buy in. And the space between the artists and the audience begins to collapse, and you really can start to feel along with one another. We go on this journey, this story together. Theater's also ritualistic. Right? It's been around for as long as human beings have been here. We've told each other stories by firelight, with footlights, with spotlights. We illuminate our truths on stage, and it's a unique thing that human beings do. And I'm glad that we do it because sometimes we don't want to look at some of the things that we do. Sometimes we don't want to remember some of the stories that have defined how we came to be where we are. But it's important that we join together in the act of looking and in the act of critical reflection and in the shared experience of storytelling so that we can begin to understand how we relate to one another and how we can all participate in the making of a brighter future by being aware of where we've been. In Penumbra, one of the symbols that's become very important to us is the Sankofa bird. Are you familiar with the Sankofa bird? It's an Adinkra symbol from the Akan of Ghana. And the Sankofa bird is a bird that's depicted facing forward with its head glancing back over its shoulders, and it has an egg in its beak. And the wisdom encapsulated in that image is that a step forward should begin with a glance back, that we can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been. And so part of what I believe Penumbra's job is to do for the Twin Cities and increasingly for a more national field is to continue to tell those stories that have defined the American experience, to continue to diversify the American narrative so that we know better where we're going and that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past out of fear or out of ignorance of our shared history. So those are some of the, I think, defining principles of both theater and of Penumbra. One of the ways in which Penumbra is differentiated from other theater companies is that we don't do art just for entertainment. We do what we call art for social change, and that's a different project. It means we have an agenda. It means that we're trying to provoke thought and that we're trying to build community and that we're trying to get people out of their comfort zones and exploring things together. And one of the most important theorists or thinkers to kind of situate this sort of work was a man named Augusto Boal. Are you familiar with Augusto Boal, anyone? Okay. He wrote a very important book called Theater of the Oppressed. And in it, what he did is he took a look at the formula for the Greek tragedy, the model of the Greek tragedy. And so what he ultimately decides as he looks at this formula is that it's an oppressive model. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of explore how that might be true with you all, with the example of Oedipus the King. Are you familiar with that play? Oedipus the King? So Oedipus was a king, right? It's a very well-written drama We follow Oedipus on his journey, and he tries very hard to be a good king and to be worthy of the post, and to be a good leader. He's given sight early on. There's sort of a foreshadowing of the mistakes that Oedipus will make, the things that will befall him. And indeed, as the play progresses, Oedipus does commit 2 crimes. Does anybody remember what the crimes are? Incest and patricide, right? And these have been foreshadowed, and yet so he knows, he's been told this is what will happen, and yet we watch as fate sort of drives him to this place where he, unknowingly commits these crimes. Now, the interesting thing about theater, and what Augusto Boal points out, is that Greek theater traditionally was performed in the round, right? And so if I'm Oedipus, and you're watching me, and you're rooting for me because you believe in my goodness, you believe that I will triumph over this fate that's been decreed, because we want to believe that we have some sense of direction in our lives and that we can change certain things that have been predestined perhaps or fated for us. And I'm struggling, and in my human struggle, you're relating to me. And yet, and still, these things happen, and it's my fault. And you've gone along this journey with me. And because I've struggled so hard, and because it's so painful when I do make those mistakes, and because I believed so much in myself, and yet I've failed. Do you remember what Oedipus does when he finds out what's happened? He blinds himself. He pokes out his eyes, right? Metaphoric, or realizing the metaphor of his, foreshadowed blindness, he physically blinds himself. And if it's a really good production, and the production values are very good, and I've captured you in my story, and I jab my eyes out, and let's say I've got really good stage blood, you're probably going to go, ugh, right? Some of you are making faces like, ew, it's early, Sarah, come on. That experience, it scares you. You feel pain, you feel disgust, you feel fear. You're watching me, but if we're in the round, you're also watching the people across from you. And what Augusto Boal says is that in that moment, that exchange between audience participants, where you're sitting and you're listening to the story and you're watching it, that we make a silent pact and we say to ourselves, look at what happened to Oedipus, I'm not going to do that, right? I will not commit these social taboos, because here's what happens. And we all leave the theater having learned our lesson, and the polis is controlled. Make sense? So theater was a tool to keep people in check. Augusto Boal says if theater can be used to oppress, we can change the model fundamentally, and we can use it to liberate. And rather than creating these divides where you have passive audience members and active actors, let's create what we call spect actors, where everyone is a part of the making of our reality together. And so I think in some ways that becomes the large project and the potential of theater, that we can all participate in the making of it. And in so doing, perhaps model better ways of being in the world together. Penumbra was founded in 1976 during a time that was called the Black Arts Movement. And it was a time period in which artists were reflecting upon all the goodwill and the momentum of the civil rights movement, but lamenting the fact that change was slow to come. And so what they wanted to do is create art that would get people talking, that would reignite that sense of personal responsibility for the vibrancy of our communities, to use theater as a tool, not just to leave it in the theater houses, but to take it out into the streets and to teach and model with it. The tenets of the Black Arts Movement said that art should be created by, for, about, and near the people it represents. And so it belonged to a community in a particular kind of a way. And to this day, the work that we stage at Penumbra is authentically African American. And that has become broadly defined over the years, many years of the advent of Africans in America. And so we have to shift and change along with that. But theater was for something, it was meant for something. And so the things that I want to talk about today, these examples, I believe, are great examples of how theater can be used, how it can create spaces for public witness, and how we can revisit stories in order to change the future. Some of these plays you may have seen if you've been to Penumbra. The first one I want to talk about was called Grandchildren of the Buffalo Soldiers. It was a play we staged in 2005 by a man named William S. Yellowrobe, Jr. Grandchildren of the Buffalo Soldiers was an interesting piece because it was the first time the play was staged. It was a brand new play by Mr. Yellowrobe, and it tackled the historic clashing of Native and African American people. Two fiercely proud yet oppressed cultures here in the United States that were pitted against one another during westward expansion. And the play depicts the homecoming of a man named Craig Robe. It sounds a lot like William Yellowrobe, who is of mixed ancestry, black and Assiniboine. And he has been ostracized by his home Native community. And what he begins to understand is that his community is really about the people with whom he shares blood ties. And so his family becomes very important to him, but they also represent an irreconciled past because they are of mixed race. The production, I think, marked an extraordinary effort on the part of both Penumbra Theater Company and our partner Trinity Repertory Theater Company to examine some of these issues that are very painful for people to address. The play began here at Penumbra in St. Paul, and then it traveled on tour, and it went to community centers and to reservation areas where there were sometimes gymnasiums where the play was produced. It went and stayed, I believe, in Sisseton, South Dakota for, I think it was 3 weeks, and then it went out east and traveled around there, and then landed finally at Trinity Repertory Theater Company, where it ended its run. Elders in the communities, both here in the Midwest and out on the East Coast, who identified themselves as sort of keepers of stories that weren't told, said that the play was an opportunity to open space for dialogue with youth who they understood were very angry because there'd been so much silence about the animosity between Black and Native people. One elder in Sisseton described the prejudice inside their community against Native people with Black ancestry as, quote, an inherited sickness that we must heal. Young community members noted that they finally understood their mother's pain and their grandmother's shame. In this moment, this play offered an opportunity for intergenerational conversation about things that there simply wasn't language around, at least not a healing language. There was an accusatory language, there was a silencing language, but a healing language hadn't yet come to the community, and we hoped that this offering of the play might do that. Just the fact that we had a drum on stage captured the attention of our audiences, particularly because they wanted to be sure that we used it respectfully. But we had listened, and the playwright who guided us through the process described the drum as an ancestor whose presence on stage needed to be honored. And there were certain ways that we had to take care of that drum because it was also opening a kind of a space on stage. So you can see the layering of rituals happening in this play. One of the things that a play does, I think, if you surround it well with contextual material, which I try to do in the education department at Penumbra, is scratch at histories that have been overwritten. And one of the things that I really wanted to stress with the play was the politics of blood, what I call the politics of blood. So in 1887, we passed something called the Dawes Act. Are you familiar with the Dawes Act? The Dawes Act was a land allotment act that basically said that it was required that you demonstrate 3/4 Native American blood in order to be able to have land. At the same time, we had a colloquial law called the one-drop rule that was circulating through our nation. Does anybody know what the one-drop rule is? 1 drop of Black blood means that you're Black. So I don't know how you find one drop of blood in anybody. But what I want us to consider is when you require 3/4 blood of a people in order to belong, are you creating more or less Native Americans? And when you suggest that only 1 drop of black blood identifies someone as black, are you creating more or less black people? So if we think about the politics of these laws, at a time in which we're gobbling up land and in which we want a free workforce, you can see how the politics of blood really benefit the powers that be. And so when I wrote the contextual essay for this play, Grandchildren of the Buffalo Soldiers, I called it, "Your Blood Ain't Redder Than Mine." Because I was trying to illuminate both the shared humanity in that journey, but also the devastating thing that that elder identified as an inherited sickness. That this competition between brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and children who belonged to the same family existed because they were pitted against one another. And that fighting over who's more Indian or who's more black really didn't matter, right? So that's one example of how a play began to open space, create space for witnessing stories that were difficult, and began to offer what you could suggest might be a healing language. I'm trying to be mindful of the time here as well. Okay. The next piece I want to talk about, we also did in 2005, and it was called Zooman and the Sign. It's by Charles Fuller. This was a remount. We did this play decades earlier, actually in the 1982-83 season, but we felt that the topic was still relevant. The play is about a family, the Tate family, whose little girl, I believe she was 9 years old, was killed by the stray bullet of gang shooting. And when we did the play in '82, audiences were electrified because they were very frustrated at that time by the apathy of police and leadership forces in the Twin Cities, because conditions were worsening within our local communities. And they had depressed into something almost unrecognizable to the elders. They literally couldn't make sense of the ways in which young people were acting. Around the time that we did the play, we began to sort of, and you never know if art's reflecting culture or if culture is reflecting art, but Taisha Edwards, I'm not sure if you remember that story, an 11-year-old girl was killed in her kitchen while she was doing her homework. And so the play opened space for people to have dialogue about what was going on. The interesting thing about Zooman and the Sign is that even though it outlines the tragic death of an innocent child, what it ultimately does is require that the community respond. So what happens after the child is killed is that the father, Mr. Tate, goes out into the community and says, "Tell me what you know. Somebody must have seen something. You're all out on your porches all summer. Doesn't anyone know anything?" And no one would say anything because they were afraid of retribution. They didn't want to get involved. So they drew their windows down, they closed off. And what he realized is this is what's keeping our community in danger. And so what his choice was is to make a sign that said the killers of our daughter are going free because our community, our neighbors won't stand up. And he hung it on his porch. So that every time every person had to go to and from their house, they had to reckon with that sign and reckon with their silence. And so he was urging them to speak and to be accountable and to be a community. So this sort of attack of indifference and apathy is really what's at the heart of the play. My father, Lou, was quoted as saying, as he was thinking about apathy and social change and how difficult, that's actually the hardest thing. It's not hard to get people to care once they care, but it's fighting apathy that really starts to eat away at our ability to change. He said, our communities have always been challenged by external threats, but over the years, they have been put under siege from within. Often we dehumanize the threat so that our reactions, our anger, our fear, our apathy seem justified. This play forces us to consider how overwhelming the problem can be, but remains unrelenting in its demand for the recognition of humanity on both sides. And so as much as that we required space to heal this family who had lost a child, there had to be healing available to the youth that were falling victim to this kind of behavior. What is it that's driving them to be so violent? What are they missing? And so what we did is we created a series of talkbacks around the play. And Al McFarlane, who's the publisher of Insight News, John Harrington, who at the time was the St. Paul Chief of Police, Spike Moss, who was a civil rights activist, Tyrone Terrell, who was the director of, St. Paul director of the Human Rights Commission, and Ava Brown, who, she was a victim of gang violence, lost a child, came together to talk to audiences about this play. And this was a time right after Columbine, the Red Lake tragedy had happened. We were really asking ourselves, what's going on? This isn't making sense. And so the play, even though we did it 20 years earlier, it was still relevant, and it still had the power to move a community out of apathy, to have conversations with one another, to sit together, to look at a story and to say, I recognize that child. I recognize that teenager. He lives down the street from me. I'm going to have a conversation with him. To talk to the police about the ways in which you're patrolling our neighborhoods aren't helpful. Are there other things that we can do? Let's not patrol violence, let's prevent it, right? So we started having those conversations because of a play. It didn't bring back the children that were lost, but maybe it prevented some children from being lost to violence or to getting involved in those gangs. I'm going to skip ahead a few years to 2009 when we did a play called The Whipping Man by Matthew Lopez. The Whipping Man begins in the once grand home of the De Leon family. It's situated in the heart of the Confederate capital, and at the time the home is disheveled and torn apart. Simon, a black man, remains waiting for the return of De Leon with his own wife and daughter. De Leon, on the other hand, Simon doesn't know, has fled with the Confederate President Davis and the rest of the cabinet. The Confederacy has fallen. Simon doesn't have word of this yet. And fearing retribution for sedition, they've left. The young master of the house, Caleb, returns, and he finds his world shattered beyond recognition. He's a defected soldier from the Confederate Army. He's wounded both by his cowardice and by a gangrenous bullet to the leg. The interesting thing is Simon, the man who's waiting for him, has raised Caleb. Simon was his slave. And when Caleb returns, he's fearful, he's urgently needing first aid. He's ordering Simon around. And Simon's taking care of him because there's love between them, in spite of the master-slave relationship. But Simon stops at one moment and he says, Caleb, all those things you're telling me to do by rights, you need to be asking me now. It's the difference in a day, right? He has rights. He's a man under the law now. He's free. And so Caleb doesn't really know what to do with this situation. He doesn't know how to move beyond it. And it's such a beautiful metaphor for the ways in which we became hemmed up as a nation and silent as a nation about the kind of repair we needed to do around our legacy of slavery, the moment of emancipation, the failed sort of efforts to equalize or to repair the damage. The interesting thing about Lopez's play is that the De Leon family are Jewish. And so the slaves that they owned practiced Judaism. And he situates the story very wisely during Passover. And so You're with me. This is why I love this group. What became so amazing is how this play opened space for conversation, particularly within the Jewish community, for recognition and for just communion. We had Jews, black and white, in our audience having conversations. They would not leave in post-play discussion because the play just raised so much for them to consider. Penumbra worked with, I don't know if you may know Rabbi Joseph Edelheit. Does anybody know Joe? He's wonderful, incredibly smart. He guided us through a lot of that process, and in particular, how to honor the Seder on stage. It was interesting to see sort of the translation of culture. The bitter herbs were collard greens, for example. We make do with what we have, where we are. But there is a cultural sort of moment that can be recognized there. With this production, we partnered with Jewish Community Action in St. Paul and the Jewish Community Center, and also in St. Paul, to create relevant programming. And we took their lead. They advised us which synagogues might be interested in having these conversations, which community groups would be interested and willing to have the conversation. And like I said, the post-play discussions were some of the highest attended in our history. The moment for them, and it's hard to recreate, theater is about witness, and that's about being in the moment. And theater's ethereal and ephemeral, and you don't get to keep it, which I hate, but I'm working with that. I'm working with flow. The witnessing the Seder, a recently freed black man performing the ritual and the rites, and having the youngest ones say, "Why is this night different from all nights?" And what Rabbi Edelheit informed us of is this is how you keep a story alive. This is how you keep a history alive. You can't recreate it, but you can tell the story. And the question that was burning for him, being a member of an oppressed group of people, was, what happens when there's no one left to say I? And it struck me so profoundly because within the African American community, there's no one left who can say I was there. I know what slavery was. And those stories, but for the Library of Congress and the WPA and people like Zora Neale Hurston and Sterling Brown, would have been lost. And it would have been quite convenient for us to lose them. And they were sitting in the annals of the Library of Congress for decades, untouched, until researchers started drawing them out. And now you can find, many, many books in which you can read firsthand accounts of slavery. And it tells us not about black history, not about black people, not about slavery, but about America, about all of us, right? That's our history, right? And those stories were alive on stage in ways that were new and were important. And so that was one of those very unique, important plays that raised perhaps more questions than it did offer answers, but that is also the function of theater. The last play that I want to talk about today is one that we haven't done yet. So it's one that I hope that you'll join us for next season. It's called The Ballad of Emmett Till. Emmett Till. For those of you who don't know who Emmett Till was, he's been called the sacrificial lamb of the civil rights movement. In 1955, Emmett Till had just turned 14, and he had been begging his mother all summer to let him go down to hang out with his cousins in Mississippi. And he'd never traveled on his own, and finally she relented and she said, "Okay, you can go." And she put him on a train, and 2 weeks later, he came back to her in a coffin. Emmett Till's death was one of the more brutal lynchings in our nation's history. He was also one of the youngest victims to be documented. He was by no means the only one. But a couple of key things happened around the case of Emmett Till that I want to draw our attention to, because I think this is where theater and the idea of public witness really matters. When Emmett Till came back to his mother, he'd been brutally beaten. His body had been left in a river, and she had to fight to get his body out of Mississippi. And the local police enforcement made the coroner in Chicago vow not to open the coffin. It had been nailed shut. And Mamie Till, went to see her only son and said to the coroner, "Do you have a hammer?" And he said, "No, ma'am, I don't." And she said, "Well, if you don't, I'm going to find one because I'm going to open that box." When she opened the box, what she saw was no longer her son. The only way they were able to identify him is by the ring he wore, which she gave him as he boarded the train. It was his father's ring. And she stood and she looked at her son, or what was left of him. And she describes what she saw. And she starts to ask all of these questions about the spectacular violence, the proof of spectacular violence that she saw. And was it really necessary, after beating him, to shoot him? And she remembered his teeth, and they were gone. He took such pride in his teeth, as did she as his mother. She remembered the curl of his ear, gone. All of these things, and it's this very tender moment where a mother looks upon what's left of her son. And she said in that moment to her family, "I want to have an open casket service. Let them see." And so what happened is that the NAACP and the Chicago Defender, which was a black newspaper, leveraged all their power, and they sent photographers, and thousands of people showed up at this service. And a picture was published in the Chicago Defender, and now we understand what it is for an image to go viral because of the internet. But at this time, that was a rare thing, for one picture to so ardently capture the hearts and the minds of a people. And it was reprinted all over the country, and it was reprinted internationally. And we couldn't quite deal with how we looked as a nation, because Mamie Till said, "Let them see." And we bore witness as a nation to that. 2 years later, we saw pictures of Elizabeth Eckford and the Little Rock Nine entering Little Rock High School and being met by a mob of angry people. These were children, and it was embarrassing for our country. And the international pressure started to change things. So we tell the story of Emmett Till next year, not so that we can create emotional theater, which I'm sure it will be. We tell the story so that we remember where we've been, so that we know better where we're going. The play won't stand alone. With it will come a study guide. We will screen films. We will hold conversations. We will remember, and we will honor this little boy who was the sacrificial lamb of the civil rights movement. So, I'm not going to cry. I'm just going to take a moment to kind of collect myself here. Because of Mamie Till's act of defiance, within a few weeks, people started planning and organizing the bus boycott. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat just a few months after Emmett Till was killed. What I want to share with you is the importance of telling these stories from an authentic space, and from a space that really tries to honor the people who lived them, versus excusing what we've done, making it easy for us, sucking all the life out of it, but allowing us to go, okay, well, I did my checky box thing. I had my culture today. Because it's important, I think, that we sit together as a community And those communities are as ephemeral as the plays themselves. Every night they're different. Every night they have their own personality. Every night they have their own beating heart. Every night they have their own chorus of voices that responds to what they've seen. And that's what theater can do. And that's what I believe Penumbra does, and why I've dedicated my life to this work. So I think theater is yet another one of those spaces that we need in our communities to have healthy conversation and to create, hopefully, a more just and humane society. So that's what I wanted to share with you all today. I don't know if you have comments or questions. For me, I'm happy to talk with you. Yes?